Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, we know, are considered to be the precursors of existentialism. And the writings of both philosophers have provided the roots or the foundation of existential thinking. Although they differ in a lot of ways, radically in terms of one, in terms of religious orientation, because we know that Kierkegaard is a deeply religious thinker, and Nietzsche, on the other hand, is a passionate atheist. So in this sense, they are wide apart. Okay? But they share the same passion for self-criticism and criticism of their age or of their own, of their milieu. So crit, uh, both can be said to be a practicing Socrates in terms of examining themselves, and not just examining themselves, but also examining other philosophies and other, modes of thinking during their time. Only that when they were philosophizing, when they were publishing their works during their time, nobody paid attention to them, especially to Nietzsche. Okay? So, but given that they developed the same themes that would later characterize the existentialist movement or the existential philosophy, they both asserted the importance of passion over reason. So this is a big break from the rationalistic philosophies of the modern era, modern philosophy. Subjectivity over objectivity, no? And the importance of the individual person over the abstract universal or the impersonal crowd. So this set them apart from the philosophies of Kant, of Schelling, of Hegel, meaning the major philosophers during the later part of modern philosophy. So they focus on the personal, they focus uh, on the subjective. Both were not given much attention during their lifetime. Some said, well, their thoughts did not have much impact on their contemporaries, which made Nietzsche to remark, I have come too early. My time is not yet. Okay? But of course, I think philosophers are like prophets. They say something, nobody believed them until what they said become true. And that's the only time we recognize the importance of these philosophers, after they are gone. Mm. So the 19th century was not yet ready to give up the idea of the idea of scientific or rational analysis of human nature can tell men everything they need to know about themselves. However, with the terror and inhumanity of the two world wars, the depersonalizing effects of mass culture, and a sense of alienation and emptiness, even in the midst of a wonderful and promising technology, the optimism of the people started to dwindle. Because really, no amount of of material technological progress can really satisfy man's longing for significance, for authenticity, for meaning. So eventually, this optimism when it comes to this promising technology eventually had a depersonalizing effect on them. But after these illusory experiences, people started to listen to the thoughts of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche on the dark side of humanity, the importance of inwardness, the importance of subjectivity, and of course the downside of the modern culture. Think philosophers, we could say, are sometimes they are like doomsayers. You know? They always tell us to, like the prophets, they tell us to go back to ourselves, look into ourselves, examine our lives, etc., etc. And both philosophers communicated the truth of their philosophies not through logically typed propositions like the previous philosophers, modern era, but through an engaging literary style that seduces man's imagination in a way that the truth is self-discovered. So it's kind of style of writing or style of communication where the truth is not forced on you, but you are invited to discover the truth for yourself. So the words somehow errate, sometimes they taunt. Some of Nietzsche's words or language is, uh, sarcastic to some extent, but consequently, they force people, those who read them, to reveal himself along with his fears, conviction, and second items, meaning their fears, their inhibitions, their baggages, etc. So that's the style of these two important philosophers. They invited us or forced us to examine ourselves. Now, let's focus now on Kierkegaard. So he was born May 5, 1813, Copenhagen. He entered the Copenhagen University in 1830. 4 years after that, his mother died. And then 3 years after that, 1837, he would meet Regine Olsen. And a year after, his father will die. 2 years later, in 1840, he passed examination in theology and in the same year proposed marriage to Regine Olsen. But of course, you know what happened to that proposal. Kierkegaard led a somewhat uneventful life, pretty much like the life maybe of Kant. Seldom left his hometown of Copenhagen. Well, he traveled abroad only 3 times, the same place, Berlin. His prime recreational activities were attending the theater, the high society living, walking the streets of Copenhagen to chat with ordinary people, and taking brief carriage jaunts into the surrounding countryside. Educated at a prestigious boys' school, and then he attended the Copenhagen University, where he studied philosophy and theology. So Kierkegaard's life is more relevant to his work than in the case of many other writers. For Kierkegaard, philosophical inquiry is neither the construction of system or the analysis of concepts. So he, as I've said, he was anti-systemic, not anti, not unsystematic, but anti-systemic. He was against systems. It is the expression of an individual existence, he said. Philosophy is an expression of individual existence. And the epitaph that he composed for himself was simply that individual, to focus on individual existence, focus on one's personal life. So for him, any verdict on his thought can also be an expression of one's own existence. Meaning, if we pass a verdict on someone, that verdict is also a verdict of your own life, a verdict of your own existence. Okay? So it's not always a critical assessment of some objective or impersonal standard. It is always an assessment based on one's subjective personal standard. So any kind of philosophy that we express or any kind of criticism that we express on the thought of other people, it will always also be an expression of your own existence, of your own life. So much of the thrust of his critique on Hegelianism is that its system of thought is detached from everyday lives of its proponents. is one with Nietzsche saying this, that philosophers of old, well, they philosophize, but their ideas are always detached from their everyday lives. If you have not read the life, or if we don't have a historical account of the life of these philosophers, we will never know their personal lives based on their philosophies, because there's a big divide between their thoughts and their lives. Very much unlike the existentialist philosophers, because you can view from their ideas, from their philosophies. You can view from their philosophies, from their ideas, their personal lives. Maybe that's the reason. That's one reason why many ordinary people identify with them. So this existential critique, according to Kierkegaard, consists in demonstrating how the life and work of a philosopher contradict one another. He's talking of the former philosophers, the other philosophers. Kierkegaard derived this form of critique from the Greek notion of judging philosophers by their lives rather than simply by their intellectual artifacts. The Christian ideal, according to Kierkegaard, is even more exacting, since the totality of what is individual existence is the artifact on the basis of which you will be judged by God for all eternity. So, for Kierkegaard, well, philosophers will always tell us about what's the ideal, what's the good life, what's the ideal life, what's the virtuous life. But for Kierkegaard, when you look at the Christian ideal, it is more exacting. Why? Because Christians believe in God, and this is the ideal that God gave them. And on the basis of this ideal, on the basis of their existence, they will be judged by God for all eternity. So for Kierkegaard, that carries far heavier weight. So therefore, an understanding of Kierkegaard's philosophy or biography, because we are relating his philosophy with his life, it's important that to understand the thoughts of Kierkegaard, we have to understand his life, his biography. So if we want to understand his writings, we need to study his biography, because his life is a source of the many preoccupations and repetitions that Kierkegaard wrote in his works. So because of his existentialist orientation, it is to work through the events of his life, especially his relationship with his mother, his father, and of course, religion also, that pervade his work. Of course, it's not just Kierkegaard who had this kind of, complicated, very complex relationship between his life and his works, because you have some other philosophers, Camus, for example, very close connection between his writings and his personal lives. Okay. Now, some influences on the life of and thoughts of Kierkegaard. So the influence of Kierkegaard's father on his work has been frequently noted. Not only did Kierkegaard inherit his father's melancholy, his sense of guilt and anxiety, and his pietistic emphasis on the dour aspects of Christian faith, but he also inherited his talents for philosophical argument and creative imagination from his father. So, how do we describe Kierkegaard's father? He was a patriarchal, self-willed father who dominated the home. He was a highly gifted man, self-taught, well-read, and much occupied with spiritual matters. And that's actually where Kierkegaard got his interest on, from his father, his interest on spiritual matters. He had a sober view of life and brought up his children to a strict form of Christianity. It's particularly emphasized the sufferings of Christ. And it was from his father that Kierkegaard inherited the deepest layers of his personality, the periodic impressions that weigh him down, as well as the outstanding powers of thought, both in the penetrating dialectic intelligence and his passionate imagination. So his father impressed on the young Kierkegaard the picture of the suffering Christ. And this picture of the suffering Christ will remain in the mind of Kierkegaard all throughout his life. And in several places, Kierkegaard wrote that the overwhelming impression of Christ, image of Christ, made in his childhood, made him, humanly speaking, intensely miserable, because the focus is always on the suffering Christ. So he said, it was all connected with the relationship with my father, the person I have loved most, because it was always his father who impressed in the mind of Kierkegaard this image of the suffering Christ. But religiously speaking, in the long run, he was grateful to his father, he said. From him, I learned what paternal affection means, and I was given the concept of divine paternal love, the only thing in life which is firm and unshakable, the true Archimedean point, he said. Now, of course, as we've said, in 1840, he became engaged with the 18-year-old girl, Regine Olsen, who belonged to the Copenhagen upper class, whom he had known and felt drawn for a year, or more than a year. And he actually became engaged with Regine Olsen. But realizing that he could not overcome his melancholy, and he cannot, of course, reveal to Regine Olsen what is the cause of this melancholy, so he decided to call off the engagement. So this engagement has also been the focus of much scholarly attention, because somehow it gives us an insight into the inner thinking, into the mind of Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard's infatuation with Regine Olsen and the sublimated libidinal energy it lent to his poetic production were crucial for setting his life course. What will be his the main focus of his life, which, based on the three stages, would be the religious life. And so he fell in love with Regine Olsen, aesthetic, came up with, of course, engaged. So he now, being engaged, being married, he will have his own ethical obligation to his wife. But it seems that the ethical life is not the highest point of life, because Kierkegaard is looking for a higher stage of life, which is the religious. And he can only reach that highest point in life, that religious stage, if he will sort of suspend the ethical, what Kierkegaard would call the teleological suspension of the ethical, in favor of the higher form of life, which is the religious stage. That's the idea of Kierkegaard. But in relation to his personal life, and we connect that to the breaking of engagement with Regine Olsen, it allowed Kierkegaard to devote himself monastically to his religious purpose. So allowing him to break, because it's always an either or, ethical or religious, break from the ethical and go to the religious. So devote himself on the religious purpose, and establish himself outside his status, outside the norm of marriage, of bourgeoisie life, that which represents the ethical life. And it also freed him from some close personal entanglements with women, thereby leading him to objectify them as ideal creatures, and there produce the patriarchal values of his church and his father. Now let's talk about his method or indirect method of communication. Kierkegaard distanced himself from his text by a variety of ways, which sometimes problematize the authorial voice of the for the reader, meaning you don't really know who is speaking. Is this still Kierkegaard, or just what is the character that he's playing in that conversation? For example, Kierkegaard used pseudonyms in many of his works, and sometimes he would partition the text into prefaces, forewords, interludes, appendices, and then he will assign authorship of the different parts to different names. Okay, different names. And sometimes Kierkegaard appended his name as author, or sometimes the publisher or the editor, or sometimes he would not include his name at all. So what is the purpose? The purpose here is for the commentators, according to the commentators, is to distance himself from the text, so that people will consider the text in itself, not because of the author who wrote it. So if you read something and you know that the author of this is, like, for example, Thomas Aquinas, then, or Aristotle, or Kant, or Hegel, then you already have this bias. So St. Thomas, so must be this, must be like this, must be like that. But if you don't know the author, then you're going to take the text at its own face value. So you will draw conclusion on your own. Okay? So, but of course, the other purpose is to avoid giving the appearance that he's attempting to construct a single, consistent, systematic edifice of thought. Okay? Remember that he was very much against the systematization of thought. So, Kierkegaard's method of indirect communication was designed to serve to sever the reliance of the reader on the authority of the author and on the received wisdom of the community. So the reader, because he does not know who wrote it, is forced to to understand it on his own and take individual responsibility for knowing who he or she is, or for knowing where he or she stands on certain existential and ethical and even religious issues that were discussed in the text. Okay, so it's up for the reader to come up with his own, to draw his own conclusion. So you have to discover the truth yourself. And of course, because he writes, or he comes up with different characters, he entices readers to view life through the lenses of these characters. So these characters' lives present different outlooks in life, and it's up to the reader to draw his or her own conclusion. So now let's go to the next point here: logical system and individual choice. And this is actually his critique of Hegel's philosophy. Logical system, meaning the system of Hegel, what Hegel prefers. Individual choice, that is the position of Kierkegaard. So, in Hegel's philosophical system, from the concept being developed the concept of becoming and the various phases of becoming, in which the abstract idea realizes itself during the course of human history. So that's sort of the summary or the gist of the idea of Hegel. And every phase of history is an expression of the gradual articulation of the concepts leading to the realization of their inadequacies and contradiction. And then, of course, every scheme will be replaced by another higher and more adequate schemes or ideas until we finally arrive at absolute knowledge or the absolute spirit. So he's describing here the dialectical process, as of course explained by Hegel. So the whole so-called process is comprehended as a single logical unfolding. And in Hegel's view, these are both moral and religious development. And these developments are just phases in the total process of development. So we are in that process, in that development. There is every phase, every stage leading to the realization of the absolute spirit. What about the individual? Well, the individual or the moral individual goes through this logical process, which start from the hedonistic project of the universal pursuit of private pleasure, then through the romantic idealization of the noble soul, then to the Kantian scheme of duty, the categorical imperative. So in this view, the individual is essentially a representative of his age. So we are just like logs in the stream of the river. We're just flowing, we're just following the course of the river. Okay? So we are just representative of this particular age. We cannot go against the current. So one's personal and religious views must give expression to his role in the total moral and religious development of mankind. A role that is already imposed upon him by his place in the historical scheme. Who knows, if we were born like during the Spanish time, we're going to have a different life. What happens if we were born, for example, during the American period, or if we were born, say, during the time of St. Thomas? That's going to be a different historical scheme, and our role will be defined by what historical scheme we are born into. So for Kierkegaard, Hegel dissolved the concreteness of individual existence into abstractions, which are characteristics of the realm of concepts. Of course, well, that's the point of Kierkegaard, but we know that for Hegel, his philosophy is not just in the realm of concepts, he was also talking about reality, concrete reality. What happens in concept happens in concrete reality. But Kierkegaard did not buy that idea. For him, this idea of Hegel is only in the realm of concepts. And he tried to apply or had tried to subsume individual existence within that realm of concepts. So any particular conceptual scheme represents not an actuality, but a possibility, according to Kierkegaard, or according to Hegel. So, but according to Kierkegaard, whether a given individual realizes this possibility and so endows it with existence, it will depend on the individual and not upon the concept. Meaning, the individual has a choice. He has a choice. So, what the individual does depends not upon what he understands of these concepts, but upon what he wills. So Kierkegaard is putting a lot of emphasis on individual wills, subjective, personal will. So Kierkegaard supported this idea, this doctrine of the will, with his view of the ultimacy of undetermined choices. He maintained that the individual constitutes himself as the individual he is through his choice of one mode of existence rather than another. It's always a choice between static or the ethical, either or, ethical or religious. You go to the religious, you fear and tremble. But it's always based on a choice. Okay? So, for him, for Kierkegaard, Christianity is not a phase in the total development of man's religious and moral ideas. Christianity is a matter of choosing to accept or to reject God's words. However, choice is not restricted to this supreme decision. Why? Because it is the very core of all human existence. So, meaning for Kierkegaard, it's all in. When you make a choice whether to accept or reject God, it's the core of all our human existence. That spells the difference between authentic and inauthentic existence. Now, going back to Hegel, the Hegelian view that human existence develops logically within and through conceptual schemes is not just an intellectual error, according to Kierkegaard. It disguises the true facts and sets aside the responsibility for choice and provides an excuse for one's choices. Excuse for one's choices. It gives the individual an excuse for making the wrong choice. So he will just say, well, it happened that I am on the wrong side of history. Just so happens that the forces, the historical forces, drew me to this path. So there's an excuse to avoid personal responsibility. It also suggests that there will be a final system that will provide an absolute viewpoint. But that viewpoint must be an illusion. Because human existence is finite. Its standpoint is partial and limited. To suppose otherwise is to yield to the temptation to pride. It is an attempt to put oneself in the place of God or to be God. So, the essence of Kierkegaard's concept of choice is that it is without objective standard or criterion. You know where it is going. It's going to this idea of faith. No objective standard or criterion. Because for him, if standards determine what I choose, then it is not I who make the choice. Standards are criteria of reason, and they appeal to logically cogent consideration. But choice is determined by the individual, and there's no objective standards when human existence is involved. Well, in the fields of other disciplines, like for example in mathematics and science, logical procedures and principles are necessary and legitimate. But in ethics, in life, they are not the demands. They are not the standards. So for him, there's no objective standards when human existence is involved. The only standard involved is our relationship with God. So Kierkegaard aims to make us aware of our individuality, particularly as Christians. He writes in his journal, the category of my understanding is to make people aware of what is essentially Christian. Further, he writes, I have worked for a relentless oriented toward inward deepening. My whole life is an epigram calculated to make people aware. Okay. So his idea is to change the way we look at ourselves, we look at life. He forces us to examine ourselves. So he's like, for me, he's like Socrates, no? Forcing us a self-examination. And after this self-examination, Kierkegaard hoped that we are enlightened intellectually and changed inwardly, not the other way around. Some people, they become enlightened, they understand, but they don't change internally. So that's the objective of Kierkegaard in his writings, to make the readers change inwardly. I will focus on one important topic on Kierkegaard, his notion of truth, because his notion of truth is connected to his notion of faith. Okay, so it's a very close, almost not just a close, really uh, a link between his notion of truth as subjectivity and faith. So one of the main themes in Kierkegaard's philosophy is the distinction between two kinds of truth, the objective and the subjective truth. So the objective truth is empirical. It is the truth that can be observed, that can be verified, the truth that is based on concrete objects, the truth that can be reduced to categories and classifications. So examples of this would be the truth that we find in the mathematics and in the sciences. So this objective truth, according to Kierkegaard, are often detached from the person and therefore do not compel a person to act based on this truth. They do not move him to act because they are not rooted in his inner core or subjectivity. For example, how will it matter to you if 2 plus 2 is 4? Unless, of course, you're talking of two, say, two bread and another bread, and then you have uh, four breads now, which you can give to other people. So it will matter now because the bread is something that can be consumed by other people. But the mathematical truth about 2 plus 2 is 4 is something that is detached from us. And not only in that detached in the sense that it does not matter to us, it's also detached because even without our personal consideration, that truth will still be true. Even if you don't realize it, it will still be true. So it does not it's not connected or attached to us. It is something that is detached. It's something that is external. It's something that is foreign. Okay, so the objective is something that is foreign, outside, external to us. Now remember that because when we discuss Marcel will also be talking about the problems. Problems are something that are detached, outside, external, okay, facing us, while the mystery is something that is within. Okay, so Kierkegaard is not so much concerned about this objective truth. Well, it's important. The objective truth is important. It is essential to the other areas of human knowledge. But for him, it is not essential to one's subjective existence. Even if you know, of course, we should know this objective truth. But even if you don't know this objective truth, for example, one can still have a subjective existence. Okay, you don't have to know have you don't need to have the knowledge of scientists or mathematicians. No? And even mathematicians and scientists do not need all this objective truth in order to, live a moral life or an authentic or meaningful life. Now let's go to the subjective. Subjective here, no, does not mean something that is arbitrary or something which is biased. No, because we can use subjective in that sense. No, when we say we have our own subjective personal interests, and if we have subjective personal interest, it could interfere in our ability to judge something objectively. But in Kierkegaard's philosophy, when you say subjective, it means something that is related to the subject, to the core, to the subject, meaning the person. Okay? So when someone, no, for example, when someone's decision is called subjective, it means that it is related to his own personal experiences. It is related to his own desires, to his interests, to his values, to his beliefs, to his ideals. Meaning, it is something that is deeply rooted in the person's inner core or subjectivity. So that's the meaning of subjective. And the task of becoming a full person in achieving genuine existence is not intrinsically affected by our possession or lack of possession of certain objective truths. As I've said, you don't have to know, for example, the objective truth about the distance between the Earth and the Moon. Hmm? It will not matter for us to have genuine existence. What matters to man, according to Kierkegaard, to his life, to his essential existence, are the subjective truths. Because these are the truths that are deeply rooted in one's self or being. So, based on this distinction, there is objective knowing and subjective knowing. There is objective knowledge of the world, okay, those things that are detached from us, and subjective knowledge of our own selves, of our own beings, of our own subjectivities, of our own desires, of our own thoughts. And there's also a distinction between knowing that truth and being or living in the truth. So we know the truth when we know true beliefs, or for example, when we speak about true propositions, true statements about the things that are external to us. But to be or to live in the truth is to embrace the truth, to hold on to the truth. And such truth is one that is subjective, meaning it's a truth that we hold dear to us. The truth about our values, the truth about our intentions, about our desires, about our own selves. So these are the truths, according to Kierkegaard, that compel us to act. Okay? So one can objectively know or grasp the truth about certain moral principles, but he can still live subjectively the truth. Meaning, yes, I study ethics and I know objectively the ethical principles. But, and at the same time, rather, not but, at the same time, I can live subjectively these moral principles. But one can also not understand the moral principles or hold on to a generate moral principle and still live morally in practice. That is, the generate principle would allow. Some people may not understand ethics. They may not understand, they may not have studied philosophy or ethics as a course, and they may ask them about values, they will never understand what values is. But they live their lives according to certain moral values. And there are also people who may understand all these objective truths, may even be a master of, must have mastered all the ethical principles, but they don't live morally. I mean, subjectively. Hmm? So man can have objective knowledge of God, but does not live his life in relation to God. Another person may not have true knowledge of God, and yet establishes a genuine relation to God. So only the person who lives a moral life, who relates genuinely with God, lives in the truth. Reminds me of what the distinction between what Buber said about the God of the philosophers and the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. The philosophers have an objective understanding of God. They have defined God as substance. They have defined God as the omnipotent being, and so on and so forth. They know God. They talk about God, but they don't talk to God. Other people, they may not have an understanding of who God is. They even don't know about omnipotent being. They don't even know what a substance is. So they don't know, or they don't have a concrete understanding, objective understanding of who God is. But these people who don't talk about God, they're actually the ones who talk to God. So the God of the philosophers is the objective God. And the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob is the subjective God. Meaning that's the God we talk to. So it is the subjective truth then, and it's correlate living in the truth that can provide a foundation for a life of commitment, a life of faith. So faith is not based on certainty, the certainty of objective truth. It's not based on that, but it is based on a belief, and belief is not a form or of knowledge, form of knowledge. Faith is a free act. It is an expression of the will. Kierkegaard defines subjective truth as an objective uncertainty. We don't, it's does not have any objective certitude, but held fast in an appropriation process of the most passionate inwardness, the deepest. So Kierkegaard, this is the highest truth attainable of a human person. So faith is the highest truth, the highest subjective truth. Although we cannot provide objective certainty, but we cling to it. We cling to it. We cling to it as if it is the source of our life, even if we cannot provide an objective explanation, cannot have objective certainty. And of course, you know the works of Dr. Rochi about Tiapo, and he connect that with faith of Kierkegaard. We'll never understand why these devotees of Nazareno would join the procession, the translation, even during pandemic. Faith involves risk, and that is a risk. It involves taking a leap. It involves commitment without the security of objective evidence. Abraham never knew what will happen when he took Isaac up the mountain to be sacrificed. He had that faith. He took a leap of faith. So faith is not based on an objective truth. It is based on a subjective truth. You take a risk, take a leap, despite the lack of objective certainty. So Kierkegaard made the discovery that one must find a truth which is true for me, the idea for which I can live and die. It's not what is true for me may not be true for you. No, because when you say what is true for me may not be true for you, we are no longer talking about subjective. We're talking of subjectivity, objectivity there. But when you say true for me, meaning it is a truth that I can risk my life. So part of human predicament is that we are all interested in far too many things and therefore are not decidedly committed to any one thing. So Kierkegaard's central task as an author is to help the reader make the truth his own, meaning to own this truth, to live by it, to stake his life for it. So that's the connection between truth and faith. Let's go to the ethics of Kierkegaard, and we'll be using here two work, the work on either or and fear and trembling. In the either or, this is where Kierkegaard talked about the two stages of life. So the book has two parts. First part deals with the notion of the aesthetic, and Kierkegaard uses this term to denote something that is personal and sensory, on the personal and sensory experience. The second part deals with ethics, but we'll see how he distinguishes different notions of ethics here. So in this part, in the second part, he discusses the merits of a social and morally proper life. In the first section is written under the simple pseudonym A, and the last section of the first part, the seducer of the diary of the seducer, is written under the synonym Johannes Climacus. And the second part is written under these pseudonyms B and the judge. Okay? So the aesthetic finds its highest expression in music, in the theater, love. No? So the aesthetic is not always something that is, some people associate that with the sensual, but it's not always the sensual. So love and art's power lies in the ability to inspire the imagination. So that's the idea of the aesthetic, the imagination. While music offers direct pleasure, art and drama or theater allows the viewer to pretend to be someone else. So when you watch, for example, a theater, or even now the theater is no longer, but in the movie, for example, you can the viewer can identify with the character. So the combination of music and drama provides a transcendent aesthetic experience. And the character of A praises Mozart's Don Juan, Don Giovanni. In that play or opera based on the story of this great lover, Don Juan. The music in the Don Giovanni opera can be enjoyed on its own because it's a beautiful music. And one can also identify with the character and pretend like he's Don Juan. So the opera teaches a valuable aesthetic lesson. Repetition dulls the pleasure. If you keep repeating the same act, you get bored. Okay? So Don Juan never repeats the act of love more than once with the same woman. So he continually repeats the act, sleeping with a different or a new woman. So what he's trying to say here is that the state, while he is devoted to pleasure, sees repetition as an enemy of pleasure, because you get bored if you keep doing the same thing, or with same thing, with the same act, with the same person. So according to A, that is the most common and an unpleasant human state, boredom. So repetition leads to boredom. So yes, you have the pleasure of the aesthetic, but if you keep doing the same thing, it leads to boredom. Now, Johannes Climacus, the author of the Seducer's Diary, explains how to maximize aesthetic pleasure. So he gave a detailed first-hand account of how he, woo a woman named Cordelia. So he plots the seduction very slowly and deliberately, and he actually takes pleasure in the planning of the seduction. And he doesn't even speak to Cordelia until in the last part of the diary. So when he makes his move, things happen very quickly, and he's soon engaged to Cordelia. But that's the thing. The estate, once he succeeds in what he plans to do, he's no longer motivated. He's not. The satisfaction is no longer there. The satisfaction is in the very act the of the seduction. Okay, so here he deliberately drove Cordelia to break the engagement, and then later come back to him. So it's not the it's not the what gives him pleasure is not the success, but the process of this of this act, or of the seduction. So, but the thing is this: once he exhausted all the imaginative and exciting possibilities with Cordelia, continuing his relationship with her would lead also to boredom. So, after he finished with Cordelia, he goes to find another woman to seduce again. So, it portrays uh, the idea or the life of the aesthetic. Yes, it's pleasurable, but if you have the same thing, then it leads to boredom. Now, the second part of the either or, written under the pseudonym B, and of course, interchangeable the judge, he sends a letter to A. Okay. In the first, in the letter, the judge tries to convince A that the ethical life is better than the purely aesthetic life. So here he argues with A, saying that marriage is actually a better life. Being married is better life than living the aesthetic life of the seducer. And the judge makes this claim on the aesthetic basis. He said that there's actually more pleasure, aesthetic pleasure, to be found in a consistent marriage than a bachelor's life who keeps, changing partners every time, or looking for a new flame every time. So he further points out that the romantic literature always focuses on what happens before marriage, but it never focuses on what happens after the marriage. Okay, so after the marriage, still pleasurable. Okay, it's still aesthetic. Okay, so uh, this fear, the static fear of repetition, is actually, according to Judge, it's cowardly and selfish. So the judge argues that uh, romantic love can exist in marriage, and goes to so far to say that marriage is actually the highest form of romantic love. So this is the life of the ethical. There's still the aesthetic pleasure, but there is consistency. Okay, you just have to commit. You just have One must have the courage to submit to repetition, because that repetition can be rewarded by a consistent, reliable aesthetic pleasure that can be found in a marriage. Okay, so the point of the judge here is that in 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 the ethical stage, you can actually still experience the aesthetic pleasure that you have in the aesthetic life on the aesthetic stage. So the judge claims that A's devotion to aesthetic prevents A from making any significant choices. So although A has a far wider range of options than the judge, because of course he can, take different women, the judge is of course committed to his wife. Uh, his choices are actually much weightier and mean much more to him than A's aesthetic choices than that A's choices mean to A. Meaning the point is, yes, you have wider choices because you can be with other people, with other women, but and the judge has limited choices because he's only his wife with him. But it's much more. Uh, it means more, no, for the judge, no, that the choice is uh, let's say it's more serious, it's more important than the choices of A's. So the aesthetic has its place. The judge agrees, uh, but the place of the aesthetic is beneath the ethical. So you have to the ethical it's on the higher plane. The judge's actual loving relationship with his wife is far better than the largely imaginary relationship between, for example, Johannes Climacus and Cordelia, or between A and other women. And the judge experiences his pleasure with another person, while the seducer's pleasure is completely in his or her own imagination about the pleasure. Now, at the end of part 2, the judge received a letter in the form of a sermon from a friend entitled "The Edification," which lies in the fact that in relation to God, we are always in the wrong. So the point of that sermon is that, yes, our choices, whether aesthetically or ethically motivated, it will always be wrong. It will never be right because there's only one being who is right, and that's God. And only by accepting that God is always right, by trying to do His will, that a person can escape the unhappiness and become an authentic self. So you see here, again, we go back to the life of Kierkegaard. You see here some parallelism. No? So, well, you have he committed, Kierkegaard, for example, committed to Regine Olsen, so that should be ethical, but it will still be wrong because there's only one true commitment, and that commitment is, is God. Okay? Now, let's go to fear and trembling. This is now where you transition from, you take the leap from the ethical to the religious. But of course, the question there, how does that happen? So this work centers in the biblical story of Abraham, who, although childless, we know his story, 80 years, more than 80 years. His wife Sarah is more than 80 years also. They've been praying for a son, never came, but finally his wish was granted by God, and he had a son, and called him Isaac. So, but 30 years later, God orders Abraham to kill his son Isaac. And you know the story, he prepared to kill Isaac, but at the last second, God spared Isaac and instead allowed Abraham to sacrifice a ram. Now, in the Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard presents four possible, retelling versions of the story, which it's with a slightly different viewpoint. So in the first version, Abraham decides to kill Isaac in accordance with God's will. Abraham convinces Isaac that he's doing it by his own will, not by God. Of course, that is not lie. That is not true. That is a lie. But Abraham says to himself that he would rather have Isaac believe God rather than, or lose his faith in him rather than lose his faith in God. So he owned the responsibility there. In the second version, Abraham sacrifices a ram instead of Isaac. And even though God spared Isaac, Abraham's faith is shaken because God asked him to kill Isaac in the first place. So yes, God did stop him, prevented him from sacrificing Isaac, but he was still shocked, surprised that God would test him. Now, the third version, God decides not to kill Isaac, and then prays to God to forgive him for having thought of sacrificing his son in the first place. And in the fourth version, Abraham cannot go through with killing Isaac, and Isaac begins to question his own faith because of Abraham's, his father's, refusal to do the commandment of God. So, of course, there's a long examination of this, of Kierkegaard. But the focus here is on how we transition from the ethical to the religious. And he stresses that the killing of Isaac is ethically wrong. It is really wrong. But it is religiously right. And he uses this story to distinguish between faith and resignation. Resignation. No? So faith is something that is dynamic, that's something that is active. Okay? You are clinging on to something. Resignation is losing everything. No? You have resigned to your fate, to your destiny. But in faith, you are holding on to something. In resignation, you have nothing to hold on. Okay? So although Abraham could have been resigned to kill Isaac, sige na nga, patayin ko na nga ito. Yung sinasabi ng Diyos. So, he claims that Abraham did not act out of resignation that God must always be obeyed, but rather out of faith that God would not do something that was ethically wrong. So, meron siya pinanghawakan. He will not allow me to do something wrong, ethically wrong. He knew that killing Isaac was ethically wrong, but he had great faith that God would spare his son. Anong gagawin ng Diyos? What would God do? He never know. Well, no evidence for that, but just the same, he followed the command of God. He would sacrifice Isaac. Of course, at the last minute, God prevented him from doing that. So Abraham decided to do something ethically wrong because he has faith in God's good will. And doing God's will is religiously right. So this is a tension between what is ethical and religious. And this causes the anxiety of Abraham. Now, so through this retelling, Abraham or Kierkegaard demonstrates this very important idea, the teleological suspension of the ethical. Okay? So what is this telos, end? You suspend a particular end. What kind of end? The end, the ethical end. So the ethical end is suspended. It's not being denied. It's just you set it aside. So you're not saying that the ethical end is wrong, but you set it aside because of something that is higher, the religious. Okay? So the teleological suspension happens when a certain ethical goal, you're talking of the ethical now, not just teleological suspension, the ethical goal is suspended because of a different goal, a higher end. Okay? So Abraham performs the teleological suspension of the ethical when he decides to kill Isaac, though he knows that it is unethical. However, Abraham decides to suspend the ethical, to put the ethical concerns aside in favor of the religious. Now, why did he do that? Why did he do this? Because he has faith in the righteousness of the end or the telos of God. It will bring about a religious telos. So because of God's faith that God will not allow an ethical telos or end, he makes what seemed to be an unethical decision and turn out it into a something that is religious. Thus he proved his faith in God. So it's like I have something very important to do. This is ethical, but I will set it aside now because there is a higher purpose that I should do. Okay? So it's not denying the ethical, it's just setting it aside because there is a higher purpose. So if you relate this to uh, the bro the breaking of the engagement, of course it's wrong to break the engagement, ethically wrong to break the engagement, but set it aside because there's a higher religious purpose. Okay, so here the term ethics here denote two things. First, the limited existential sphere, okay, so, which supersedes the first, the highest, and it is also an aspect of life that we retain even within the religious life. We still have to maintain ethics in the religious life. We still have to be ethical. So we're not saying here that when you become religious, you will no longer be ethical. We still do ethical, but it's a kind of ethics that is already subsumed in the religious, because the other kind of ethical is the lower form, well, the second, no, the ethical. Okay, so what else? I'm trying to I have 7 minutes. All right, so that's the theological suspension of the ethical. But again, how do you suspend this? You have to embrace the ethical. You really have to give importance to the ethical. You have to put value in it, because it will not make sense suspending the ethical if it doesn't make sense to you. It will not make sense for Abraham to suspend the ethical of killing his son Isaac if he does not believe that killing Isaac, he does not believe that killing Isaac is wrong. So he will just continue with that. So the theological suspension of the ethical presupposes that we embrace the ethical in the first sense, meaning we embrace this stage of this second stage of life, of existence, but we leave it behind, we set it aside because there is a much higher stage. And for Kierkegaard, that is actually what brings authentic existence. Okay. Now I still have here the three stages. These are actually explanation of the three stages, and I think you can just read this. It's still a lot, but I think you can understand that already. Now, the transition from the ethical, last point, ethical to the religious, okay, is of course described as a kind of leap of faith. So you spend the ethical, and the next step is to leap that faith into the religious states. Now, why is it a leap of faith? Well, as we've said already, faith does not offer us any objective guarantee or certainty. It is a risk that we have to take, okay? Because there's no guarantee. I mean, there's no objective truth that would support this belief in the religious. Okay. Okay. What else? I think some of this you can just you can just read this. I have, I think, covered here faith. Then I already made this distinction when I said that faith is not made once and for all, that it's essential for faith to be constantly renewed by means of repeated avowals of faith. So there should be repetition of faith, repeated avowals of faith. So it does not happen just one time. Okay? So this repetition of faith is the way the self relates itself to itself and to the power which constituted it. That means repetition of the faith of faith is the self, meaning the self should keep repeating these avowals of faith. Now, last point here, I think I have already mentioned this about his concept of religion and faith. He was very critical of the church during his time because, as we have said, well, they are just been following all these, rituals or these dogmas. And for Kierkegaard, Christian faith is not a matter of reciting church dogma or it's a matter of individual subjective passion. Okay, so of course, my commentary to that is we still have to respect to follow the church dogma, but we should not end there. No, our faith should be two-way. I mean, two things. We have, as a Catholic or a Christian, you have to believe in the teachings of the church, the institutional teachings of the church, but do not stay there. You have to take these teachings, this dogma to heart, and make that part of your own subjective passion.